Section 21 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr Natter. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. Great Navigators of the 18th Century, by Jules Verne. First Part, Chapter 5, Part 1. Captain Cook's Third Voyage. 1b. On the 29th of May, Cook set sail on his return to Annamooka, thence to Tonga Tabou, where a feast or keiva more magnificent than any he had seen was given in his honor. That is to say, the dances of the night were performed in front of Finaou's house. We saw 12 dances during the time. They were executed by women, and in the midst of them we noticed the arrival of a number of men, who formed a ring within that of the dancing women. 24 men, who executed a third, made a movement with the hands, which was greatly applauded, and which we had not previously seen. The orchestra was renewed once. Finaou appeared upon the scene at the head of 50 dancers, most magnificently apparelled. His garment consisted of cloth and a large piece of gauze, and round his neck small figures were suspended. Cook, after a stay of 3 months, thought it well to leave these enchanting islands. He distributed a share of the cattle he had bought at the Cape, and explained, through Mai, the way of feeding them and their utility. Before leaving, he visited a cemetery, or fiatoka, belonging to the king, composed of 3 good-sized houses, placed on the edge of a sort of hill. The planks of these buildings, and the artificial hills which supported them, were covered with pretty movable pebbles, and flat stones, placed erect, surrounded the whole. One thing which we had not previously seen was that the buildings were open on one side, and within there were 2 wooden busts, roughly carved, one at the entrance and the other a little within. The natives followed us to the door, but dared not pass the threshold. We asked them the meaning of the busts. They assured us that they did not represent any divinity, but were intended to recall 2 chiefs who were buried in the fiatoka. Leaving Tonga Tabou on the 10th of July, Cook repaired to the small of Eoa, where his old friend Tai One received him cordially. The captain learned from him that the property of the various islands in the archipelago belonged to the chiefs of Tonga Tabou, which was known as the land of the chiefs. Thus Poulaho had 150 islands under his rule. The most important are Vavao and Hamao. As for the Viti Islands, which are comprised in this number, they were inhabited by a warlike race, very superior in intelligence to those of the Friendly Islands. We can only refer to some of the many and interesting particulars collected by the captain and the naturalist Anderson, which relate to the gentleness and docility of the natives. Cook could do nothing but praise the welcome accorded to him each time he stayed in the archipelago. But then he did not guess the project entertained by Finaou and the other chiefs of assassinating him during the nocturnal feast of Hapae, and of seizing his vessels. The navigators who succeeded him were not lavish in their praises, and if we did not know his sincerity, we should be tempted to think that the illustrious mariner gave the name of Friendly Islands to this group satirically. The inhabitants of Tonga Island always mourned the death of a relation by hitting themselves on their cheeks, and by tearing them with whales' teeth, a custom which explains the many tumors and cicatrices they have on the face. If their friends are dangerously ill, they sacrifice 1 or 2 joints of their little finger to propitiate the divinity, and Cook did not meet with 1 native in 10 who was not mutilated. The expression taboo, he says, which plays so great a part in the language of this people, has a very wide significance. When they are not allowed to touch anything, they say it is taboo. They also told us that if the king enters a house belonging to one of his subjects, the house becomes taboo, and the owner of it may not live in it any longer. Cook fancied he had made out their religion. Their principal god is Kalafoutonga, and in his anger he destroys plantations and scatters illness and death. The religious ideas of all the islands are not alike, but the immortality of the soul is unanimously admitted. Although they do not offer fruit or other productions of the earth to their divinity, they sacrifice human victims. Cook lost sight of the Tonga Islands on the 17th of July, and the expedition arrived in sight of an island called Tabouai by the inhabitants upon the 8th of August, after a series of tempestuous winds, which caused serious damage to the Discovery. All the eloquence of the English failed to bring the natives on board. Nothing would induce them to leave their boats, and they contented themselves with inviting the strangers to visit them. But as time pressed, and Cook had no need of provisions, he passed the island without stopping, although it appeared to him fertile, and the natives assured him that it abounded in pigs and fowls. Strong, tall, and active, the natives had a hardy and savage appearance. They spoke the Tahitan language, which made intercourse with them easy. Some days later, the verdant summits of Tahiti appeared on the horizon, and the two vessels were not slow in stopping opposite the peninsula of Tairabon, where the welcome Mai received from his compatriots was as indifferent as possible. His brother-in-law, Chief Oati, would scarcely consent to recognize him. But when Mai showed him the treasures he brought back, amongst them all the famous red feathers, which had been so successful in Cook's last voyage, Oati changed his demeanor, treated Mai affably, and proposed to change names with him. Mai was overcome by these demonstrations of tenderness, and, but for Cook's interference, would have been robbed of all his treasures. The ships were well supplied with red feathers. Therefore fruits, pigs, and fowls appeared in great abundance during the stay in port. Cook, however, soon proceeded to Matavai Bay, where King Otoo left his residence at Panay to pay his old friend a visit. Mai was disdainfully received by his friends there also, and although he threw himself at the king's feet, when he presented him with a tuft of red feathers and 3 pieces of gold cloth, he was scarcely noticed. But as at Takabou, the treatment changed suddenly upon the discovery of Mai's fortune, but he being only happy in the company of vagabonds, who laughed at him good-naturedly even while they robbed him, was unable to acquire the influence over Otoo and the principal chiefs, which was necessary to the development of civilization. Cook had long heard that human sacrifices were common in Tahiti, but he had always refused to believe it. A solemn ceremonial which he saw at Atahour no longer allowed him to doubt the existence of the practice. In order to gain the favourable assistance of the Atoua or Godon in an expedition against the island of Eimeo, a man of the lowest social rank was killed by blows with clubs in the king's presence. As an offering, the hair and one eye of the victim was placed before the king, last signs of the cannibalism which formerly existed in this archipelago. At the end of this barbarous ceremony, which was a blot in the memoirs of so peaceable a people, a kingfisher alighted in the foliage. "It is Atoua!" cried Otoo, delighted at the happy augury. Next day the ceremony was to be continued by a holocaust of pigs. The priests, like the Roman augurs, sought to read the history of the expedition in the dying struggles of the victims. Cook, who had silently assisted at the ceremony, could not conceal the horror with which it inspired him. Mai interpreted for him, eloquently and forcibly. Towha could scarcely contain his anger. "If the king had killed a man in England," said Mai, "as he has done the unhappy and innocent victim he has offered to his gods, it would have been impossible to save him from hanging, a punishment reserved for murderers and assassins." Mai's severe reflection was a little out of place. Cook should have remembered that manners vary with countries. It is absurd to attempt to apply to Tahiti, as punishment for that which is their custom, a punishment reserved in London for what is considered a crime. "Every man's house is his castle," says a popular proverb, which European nations have too often forgotten. Under the pretext of civilization, they have often shed more blood than would have flowed if they had not interfered. Before he left Tahiti, Cook bestowed all the animals he had had so much difficulty in bringing from Europe upon Otoo. They were geese, ducks, turkeys, goats, sheep, horses, and cattle. Otoo was at a loss to express his gratitude to the Areke no Pretonne, King of Britain, especially when he found that the English could not take a large pirogue on board, which he had constructed as an offering for his friend the King of England, it being too large. The Resolution and the Discovery left Tahiti on the 30th of September, and anchored at Eimeo. In this place their stay was marked by a painful incident. Frequent thefts had occurred for several days, when a goat was stolen. To make an example, Cook burned 5 or 6 cabins, and set fire to a large number of pirogues, threatening the king with his anger if the animal were not immediately produced. As soon as he had obtained satisfaction, the captain started for Huaheine, with Mai, who was to settle on that island. A sufficiently large space of land was ceded by the chiefs of the Ouare settlement in return for such presents. Upon this, Cook had a house built, and planted a garden, where he planted European cabbages. Mai was left with 2 houses, 2 goats, and fowls. At the same time he was presented with a present of a coat of mail, of a complete set of armor, powder, balls, and guns. A portable organ, an electrical machine, fireworks, and domestic and agricultural implements completed the collection of useful and ornamental presents, intended to give the Tahitans an idea of European civilization. Mai had a sister married at Huaheine, but her husband occupied too humble a position for him to attempt to despoil him. Cook then solemnly declared that the native was his friend, and that in a short time he should return to ascertain how he had been treated, and that he should severely punish those who had acted badly to him. His threats were likely to be effective, as a few days earlier some robbers, caught in the act by the English, had had their heads shaved and their ears cut. A little later, at Raiatea, in order to force the natives to send back some deserters, Cook had carried off the entire family of the chief Oreo on one rope. The moderation exhibited by the captain in his first voyage constantly diminished. Every day he became more severe and exacting. This change in his conduct was fatal to him. The 2 Zealanders who had asked to accompany Mai were landed with him. The elder readily consented to live at Huaheine, but the younger conceived such an affection for the English that it was necessary to use force, as it were, to land him, amid the most touching demonstrations of affection. At the last moment, as anchor was weighed, Cook bid farewell to Mai, whose expression and tears testified to his comprehension of all he was to lose. Although Cook left satisfied with having loaded the young Tahitan, who had trusted himself to him, with benefits, he was also full of anxious fears as to his future. He knew his light and inconstant character, and he left him weapons with some regret, fearing that he might make a bad use of them. The king of Huaheine gave Mai his daughter in marriage, and changed his name to Paori, by which he was afterwards known. Mai profited by his high station to show his cruelty and inhumanity. Always armed, he began to try his skill with pistol and gun upon his fellow countrymen. His memory, therefore, is hated in Huaheine, and the memory of his crimes was for a long time associated with that of the English. Cook visited Raiatea before leaving the island. He found his friend Ore deprived of supreme authority. Then he went to Bolabole on the 8th of December, and bought of the king pony and anchor, which Bougainville had lost in the roadstead. During his long sojourns in the different islands of the Society Archipelago, Cook completed his geographical, hydrographical, and ethnological investigations, as well as his studies of natural history. In this difficult task he was seconded by Anderson and by his entire staff, who invariably showed the greatest zeal in their efforts for the advancement of science. On the 24th of December, Cook discovered another low island. It was uninhabited, and the crew obtained abundance of turtle there. It was named Christmas Island, in honor of the solemn anniversary of the morrow. Although 17 months had passed since he had left England, Cook considered his voyage as only begun. Indeed, he had not as yet been able to put the part of his instructions relating to the exploration of the southern Atlantic and the search for a north passage into execution. End of section 21. Section 22 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr Natter. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. Great Navigators of the 18th Century, by Jules Verne. First part, CHAPTER V Part II Captain Cook's Third Voyage 2a Discovery of the Sandwich Islands Exploration of the Western Shore of America From thence to Bering Straits Return to the Hawaiian Group History of Rono Death of Cook Return of Expedition to England. On the 18th of January, 1778, in longitude 160 degrees and latitude 20 degrees north, the two vessels perceived the first islands of the Sandwich or Hawaiian archipelago. It did not take long to convince the navigators that they were inhabited. A large number of pirogues left Atoi or Tavai Island and surrounded the ships. The English were not a little surprised at hearing these natives speak in the Tahitan language. On this account the intercourse between them was soon friendly, and next day numbers of the islanders agreed to go on board. They showed their astonishment and admiration at the sight of so many unknown objects by their looks, gestures, and continual exclamations. Iron they were acquainted with, and called hamaite. But their covetousness was soon excited by so many curiosities and precious things, and they tried to appropriate them both by honest and by illicit means. Their cleverness and their taste for thieving was as keen as is usual with the natives of the southern seas. It was necessary to take 1,000 precautions, and they were often taken in vain, to guard against their larceny. The English, when they approached the shore, under charge of Lieutenant Williamson, to sound and search for anchorage, were forced to repulse the attempts of the natives by force. The death of one of them repressed their turbulence in a measure, and gave them an exalted opinion of the strength of the new arrivals. As soon, however, as the Resolution and Discovery had cast anchor in Owaimea Bay, Cook had himself taken on shore. He had scarcely touched land, when the natives assembled in a crowd upon the strand, prostrated themselves at his feet, and welcomed him with signs of the most profound respect. This extraordinary reception gave promise of a pleasant stay, for provisions appeared to be abundant. Fruits, pigs, fowls began to arrive from all parts. At the same time a party of natives assisted the English sailors in filling the casks with water, and in carrying them on board. Anderson and the draughtsman Weller were encouraged by this friendly conduct to advance into the interior. They were not long in coming upon a morai, similar in every respect to the Tahitian morais. This discovery confirmed the English in the ideas induced by the similarity of the language with that of the Tahiti. An engraving in Cook's narrative represents the interior of this morai. In it 2 figures may be seen, standing, the top of the heads disappearing in high cylindrical hats, similar to those on the statues in the Easter Island. In any case, the singular resemblance gives rise to reflection. Cook remained 2 days more in this anchorage, and could only extol the traffic with the natives. He then explored the neighboring island of Oneehew. In spite of his great wish to explore the interesting archipelago, he set sail, and from a distance perceived Oahu Island, and the reef of Tahura, which he designated by the general appellation of Sandwich Archipelago. This name has been superseded by the native appellation of Hawaii. Strong and vigorous, although of medium height, the Hawaiians are represented by Anderson as being of frank and loyal character, not so serious as the natives of the Friendly Islands. They are less frivolous than the Tahitans. Clever, industrious, and intelligent, their plantations showed a knowledge of rural economy, and an extensive taste for agriculture. They not only abstained from showing the childish and common curiosity which the English had so often noticed, but they inquired into their customs, and evinced a certain regret for their own inferiority. The population appeared considerable, and was estimated at 30,000 in Tavai Island alone. In their style of dress, their choice of food, their manner of preparing it, and their general habits, they conform to the customs of Tahiti. This identity of 2 populations separated by a large stretch of sea gave the English much food for reflection. During his first stay, Cook did not become acquainted with any chief, but Captain Clerke, of the Discovery, at last received a visit from one. He was a young and well-made man, wrapped up from head to foot. The natives testified their respect by kneeling before him. Clark made him several presents, and in return received a vase decorated with 2 small figures, fairly well sculptured, which served for the kava, a favorite drink of the Hawaiians, as well as the natives of Tonga. Their weapons comprise bows, clubs, and lances, the latter made of a strong and durable wood, and a sort of poignard called papoa, terminating in a point at both ends. The custom of taboo was just as universally practiced as in the Friendly Islands, and the natives were always careful to ask if things were taboo before they touched them. On the 27th of February, Cook continued his course to the north, and soon fell in with the sea wrack of the rocks mentioned by the narrator of Lord Anson's voyage. On the 1st of March he steered for the east, in order to approach the American coast, and 5 days later he recognized New Albion, so named by Francis Drake. The expedition, coasting at a distance, surveyed Cape Blanc, already seen by Martin d'Aguilar on the 19th of January 1603, and near which the geographers placed a large opening to the strait the discovery of which they attributed to him. Shortly afterwards the latitude of Juan de Fuca was reached, but nothing resembling it was discovered, although this strait really exists, and divides the continent from Vancouver's Island. Cook soon reconnoitred a bay in latitude 49 degrees 15 minutes, to which he gave the name of Hope Bay. He anchored there to obtain water, and give a little rest to his worn-out crews. The coast was inhabited, and 3 boats approached the vessel. One of the savages, he says, rose up, and with many gesticulations made a long speech, which we understood as an invitation to land. In addition, he threw feathers towards us, and many of his companions threw us handfuls of dust or red powder. The native who usurped the post of orator was clothed in a skin, and in each hand he held something which he shook, and which emitted a sound like that of a child's rattle. When he was tired of haranguing and exhorting, of which we did not understand a word, he rested, but 2 other men took up the speech in succession. Their speeches were not so long, and they did not declaim so vehemently. Many of the natives had their faces painted in an extraordinary way, the feathers fixed in their heads. Although they appeared friendly, it was impossible to persuade any of them to come on board. However, as the vessels had cast anchor, the captain had the sails furled, took in the topmasts, and unrigged the mizzenmast of the Resolution, in order to allow of repairs. Barter with the Indians soon commenced, and the most rigorous honesty prevailed. The objects offered were bear and wolf skins, and those of foxes, deers, and polecats, weasels, and especially otters, which are found in the islands east of Kamtchatka. Also clothes made by a kind of hemp, bows, lances, fish hooks, monstrous figures, and a kind of stuff of hair or wool, bags filled with red ochre, trinkets of copper and iron, shaped like horseshoes, which they wore hung from the nose. Human ears and hands, not yet free from flesh, struck us most among the things they offered us. They made us clearly understand that they had eaten the portions that were missing, and we indeed perceived that these hands and ears had been on the fire. The English were not long in ascertaining that these natives were as habitual robbers as any they had hitherto met with. They were even more dangerous, as, possessing iron implements, they could easily cut the cords. They combined their thefts with intelligence, and one of them amused the sentinel at one end of the boat, whilst another snatched the iron from the other end. They sold a quantity of very good oil, and a great deal of fish, especially sardines. When the numerous repairs needed by the ships were made, and the grass required for the few goats and sheep remaining on board had been shipped, Cook set sail on the 26th of April, 1778. He gave the name of King George's Sound to the spot where he had stayed, although it was called Nootka by the natives. The vessels had scarcely gained the open sea when a violent tempest overtook them, during which the Resolution sprung a leak on the starboard side below the water line. Carried away by the storm, Cook passed the spot selected by geographers as the situation of the Strait of Admiral de Fonte, although he greatly wished to dispel all doubts on the subject. The captain therefore continued along the American coast, surveying and naming the principal points. During this cruise he had constant intercourse with the Indians, and was not slow in noticing that their canoes had been replaced by boats, of which only the framework was wood, and over which were spread sealskins. After a stay at Prince William's Sound, where the leak of the Resolution was repaired, Cook resumed his voyage, reconnoitred and named Elizabeth and St. Hermogene Capes, Banks Point, Capes Douglas and Bede, San Augustine's Mount, the river Cook, Kodiak Island, Trinity Island, and the islands called Schumagin by Bering. Afterwards he passed Bristol Bay, Round Island, Calm Point, Newenham Cape, where Lieutenant Williamson landed, and Anderson Island, so called in honor of the naturalist who died there of disease of the chest. Later King Island and Prince of Wales Cape, the most western extremity of America. Cook then passed the Asiatic coast and entered into communication with the Tchouktchis, entered Bering Strait on the 18th of April, and next week came in contact with ice. He tried in vain to survey in various directions. The iceberg presented an insuperable barrier. On the 17th of April, 1778, the expedition was in latitude 70 degrees 41 minutes. During an entire month he coasted the iceberg in the hope of finding an opening which might enable him to proceed to the north, but in vain. It was remarked that the ice was clear and transparent except in the upper part, which was slightly porous. I supposed, says Cook, that it was frozen snow, and it appeared to me that it must have been formed in the open sea, both because it is improbable, or rather impossible, that such enormous masses could float down rivers which contain too little water for a boat, and also because we perceived no produce of the earth, which we must have done if it was so formed. Up to this date the passage through Bering's Strait had been the least used to reach the northern latitudes. Cook's observation is valuable, as it proves that beyond this aperture a vast extent of sea without land must exist. It may possibly be, this was the view held by the lamented Gustave Lambert, that this sea is open. No greater distance north has ever been attained since Cook's time, except on the Siberian coast, where Plover and Long Islands were discovered, and where at this moment as we write Professor Nordenskjold is exploring. Translator's note. On the 5th of September, 1879, a telegram from Stockholm announced that the Swedish Arctic expedition under Professor Nordenskjold had made the northeast passage from Europe to Japan, and that the Swedish exploring vessel, the Vega, had arrived at Yokohama by way of Bering Straits. The end of note. After most careful exploration and repeated efforts to reach higher latitudes, Cook, seeing that the season was advanced, and encountering more icebergs daily, had no choice but to seek winter quarters in a more clement country, before continuing his expedition the following summer. He therefore retraced his route as far as the Unalaska Island, and on the 26th of October steered towards the Sandwich Islands, hoping to complete his survey of them during his wintering there. An island was discovered on the 26th of November. The natives sold quantities of fruits, roots, breadfruits, potatoes, taro, and eddy roots, which they exchanged for nails and iron implements. It was Maui Island, which forms part of the Sandwich Archipelago. Shortly afterwards, Owhyhee or Hawaii was sighted, the summits of which were covered with snow. The captain says, "We never met savages so liberal as these in their views. They usually send the different articles they wish to sell to the ships. They then come on board themselves, and finished their trade on the quarter deck. The Tahitans, in spite of our constant stays there, have not the same confidence in us. I conclude from this that the inhabitants of Owhyhee are more accurate and true in their reciprocal trade than those of Tahiti, for the latter have no honor among themselves, and are thus not inclined to believe in the honor of others." End of section 22. Section 23 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr Natter. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. Great Navigators of the 18th Century. By Jules Verne. First Part, Chapter 5, Part 2. Captain Cook's Third Voyage. 2b. On the 17th of January, Cook and Clerke cast anchor in a bay, called by the natives Karakakoa. The sails were unbent from the yard. The yards and the topmasts struck. The vessels were crowded with visitors and surrounded by pirogues, and the shore was covered by a curious multitude. Cook had never previously seen so much excitement. Among the chiefs who came on board the Resolution, a young man named Pareya was soon remarked. He said he was Yakane, but it was not known that was the title of office, or if it suggested a degree of relationship or reliance with the king. However, he evidently had great authority over the common people. Some presents, opportunely given, attached him to the English, and he rendered them more than one service. If Cook on his first visit to Hawaii pronounced that the natives were little disposed to robbery, he was not of the same opinion this time. Their large numbers gave them many facilities for thieving trifles, and encouraged them to think that their larceny would not be punished. It became evident at last that they were encouraged by their chiefs, for several stolen objects were found in the possession of the latter. Pareya and another chief named Kanena brought an old man on board whose name was Koa. He was very thin, and his body was covered with white scruff from immoderate use of ava. He was a priest. When he was presented to Cook, he put a sort of red mantle which he had brought upon his shoulders, and gravely delivered a long discourse as he gave him a little pig. It was soon proved that it was intended as a form of adoration, for all the idols were clothed in similar stuff. The English were immensely astonished at the whimsical ceremonies of homage presented to Cook. They only understood them later, through the researches of the learned missionary Ellis. We shall give a brief account of his interesting discovery. It will make the recital of the events that followed plainer. According to tradition, a certain Rono, who lived under one of the ancient kings of Hawaii, had killed his wife, whom he tenderly loved, in a transport of jealousy. The grief and sorrow which followed upon his act drove him mad. He ran about the island, quarrelling with and striking everybody. At last, tired out but not satiated with murder, he embarked, promising to return one day upon a floating island, bringing cocoa nuts, pigs, and dogs. This legend had been embodied in a national song, and became an article of faith with the priests, who added Rono to their list of deities. Confident in the fulfilment of the prediction, they awaited his coming every year, with a patience which nothing could exhaust. Is not there a strange resemblance between this legend and that relating to the Mexican god Quetzalcoatl, who, forced to fly from the wrath of a more powerful god, embarked upon a skiff of serpent skin, promising those who accompanied him to return at some later time and visit the country with his descendants? As soon as the English ships appeared, the high priest Koa and his son Onela declared that it was Rono himself, fulfilling his prediction. From that moment Cook was a divinity for the entire population. As he went about, the natives prostrated themselves. The priests made him speeches or addressed prayers to him. They would have sprinkled him with incense had that been fashionable at Hawaii. The captain felt that there was something extraordinary in these demonstrations, but, unable to understand it, he resigned himself, for the sake of the crew and for the advancement of science, to the mysterious circumstances he was unable to unravel. He was obliged to give himself up to all kinds of ceremonies, which appeared, to him at least, ridiculous. Thus he was taken to a morai, a solid construction of stone 40 rods long and 14 high. The summit was well built, and was surrounded by a wooden balustrade, upon which were hung the ears of the captives sacrificed to the gods. At the opening of the platform were 2 large wooden figures with grinning faces, and bodies draped in red stuff, the heads surmounted by a large piece of sculpted wood, the shape of a reversed cone. There Koa mounted with Cook upon a sort of table, under which lay a rotten pig and a quantity of fruit. Some men brought a living pig in a procession, and some scarlet cloth in which it was wrapped. The priests then sang some religious hymns, while the assistants were devoutly prostrated at the entrance of the morai. After various ceremonies, which it would take too long to describe, a pig, cooked in the oven, was presented to the captain, with fruits and the roots which were used in the preparation of ava. The ava, says Cook, was then handed round, and when he had tasted it, Koa and Pareya divided the flesh of the pig into several pieces, which they placed in their mouths. I felt no repugnance when Pareya, who is very clean, gave me something to eat, says Lieutenant King, but Cook, to whom Koa offered the same attention, could not swallow a morsel, as he thought of the putrid pig. The old man, wishing to redouble his politeness, tried to give him pieces already chewed, and one can easily imagine that the disgust of our captain increased. After the ceremony, Cook was conducted to his boat by 4 men carrying sticks, who repeated the same words and phrases as at the landing, in the midst of a kneeling host of the natives. The same ceremonies were observed every time the captain landed. One of the priests always walked before him, announcing that Rono had landed, and ordering the people to prostrate themselves. If the English had reasons to feel satisfied with the priests, who loaded them with attentions and presents, it was otherwise with the Karis, or warriors. The latter encouraged the robberies which were perpetrated daily, and in other ways exhibited disloyalty. Still, up to the 24th of January, 1779, no important event occurred. Upon that day the English were surprised to see that none of the pirogues left the river to trade with the ships. The arrival of Terreobo had made the bay taboo, and prevented any communication with the strangers. Upon the same day the chief, or rather king, went without ceremony to the ships. He had but 1 pirogue, in which were his wife and children. On the 26th, Terreobo paid a second visit, which was official. Cook, says the narrative, noticing that the prince landed, followed him and arrived about the same time. He conducted them to the tent. They were scarcely seated when the prince rose, and in a graceful manner threw his mantle over the captain's shoulders. He further placed a hat of feathers upon his head, and a curious fan in Cook's hands, at whose feet he also spread 5 or 6 very pretty mantles of great value. Terreobo and the principal chiefs of his suite asked many questions of the English as to the time of their leaving. The captain wished to ascertain the opinion the Hawaiians had formed of the English, but he could only learn that they supposed them to be the natives of a country where provisions were scarce, and that they had simply come there to fill their stomachs. This conviction arose from the emaciated appearance of some of the sailors, and from the desire to ship fresh victuals. There was no fear, however, of exhausting their provisions, in spite of the immense quantity which had been consumed since the English arrived. It is very likely that the king wished for time to prepare the present he intended to offer the strangers upon their leaving, and accordingly, the day before the one fixed upon, the king begged Captains Cook and Clerk to accompany him to his residence. Enormous heaps of every kind of vegetable, parcels of stuff, yellow and red feathers, and a herd of pigs were collected together. All of this was a gratuitous gift to the king from his subjects. Terreobo chose about 1/3 of these articles, and gave the rest to the 2 captains, a more valuable present than they had ever received either at Tonga or Tahiti. On the 4th of February the vessels left the bay, but the damage received by the Resolution forced her to put in again in a few days. The vessels had scarcely cast anchor before the English noticed a change in the conduct of the natives. Still, all went on peaceably until the afternoon of the 13th. Upon that day several chiefs wished to prevent the natives from assisting the English in filling their casks. A tumult ensued. The natives armed themselves with stones and became threatening. The officer in command of the detachment was ordered by Cook to draw upon the natives if they persisted in throwing stones or became insolent. Under these circumstances a pirogue was fired into, and it was soon apparent that a robbery had been committed by its crew. At the same time a still more serious dispute arose. A sloop belonging to Parea was seized by an officer who took it to be the Discovery. The chief hastened to claim his belongings, and to protest his innocence. The discussion grew animated, and Parea was overthrown by a blow from an oar. The natives, who had hitherto been peaceable observers, armed themselves with stones, forced the sailors to retire precipitately, and took possession of the pinnace which had brought them. Parea, forgetful of his resentment at the moment, interposed, and restored the pinnace to the English, together with several things which had been stolen. "I am afraid the Indians will force me to violent measures," said Cook upon learning what had passed. "We must not allow them to believe that they have gained an advantage over us." The boat of the Discovery was stolen upon the 13th or 14th of February. The captain determined to possess himself of the person of Terreobo or some other of the leading persons, and to keep them as hostages until the stolen objects were restored to him. He therefore landed with a detachment of marines, and pursued his way to the king's residence. He was received with the usual marks of respect on the road, and perceiving Terreeoboo and his two sons, to whom he said a few words on the theft of the sloop, he decided to pass the day on board the Resolution. The matter took a happy turn, and the two young princes embarked upon the pinnace, when one of Terreeoboo's wives begged him with tears not to go on board. Two other chiefs joined her, and the natives, frightened by the hostile preparations they saw, began to crowd round the king and captain. The latter hurried to embark, and the prince appeared willing to follow him, but the chiefs interposed, and used force to prevent his doing so. Cook, seeing that his project had failed, and that he could only put it into execution by bloodshed, gave it up, and walked quietly along the shore to regain his boat, when a rumor spread that one of the principal chiefs had been killed. The women and children were therefore sent away, and all directed their attention to the English. A native armed with a pahoa defied the captain, and as he would not cease his threats, Cook discharged his pistol. The native, protected by a thick mat, did not feel himself wounded, and so became more audacious. Several others advanced, and the captain discharged his gun at the nearest and killed him. This was the signal for a general attack. The last that was seen of Cook was his signing to the boats to cease firing, and to approach, that his small troop might embark. In vain. The captain was struck and fell to the earth. The natives, says the narrative, uttered cries of joy when they saw him fall. They at once dragged his body along the shore, and taking the poniard one after the other, they all attacked him with ferocious blows, until he ceased to breathe. Thus perished this great navigator, assuredly the most illustrious produced by England. The boldness of his undertakings, his perseverance in carrying them out, and the extent of his knowledge, all made him a type of the true sailor of discovery. What immense service he had rendered to geography! In his first voyage he reconnoitred the Society Islands, proved that New Zealand is formed of two islands, explored the strait that separated them, and surveyed its coast, and lastly he visited the entire eastern coast of New Holland. In his second voyage he proved the chimerical character of the long talked of Antarctic continent, the dream of stay-at-home geographers. He discovered New Caledonia, southern Georgia, the Sandwich Islands, and penetrated farther into the southern hemisphere than any one had done before him. In his third expedition he discovered the Hawaiian archipelago, and surveyed the eastern coast of America to the 43rd degree, that is to say, an extent of 3,500 miles. He passed through Bering Straits, and ventured into the Arctic Sea, which was the horror of navigators, until the icebergs opposed an impenetrable barrier to his progress. It is needless to praise his qualities as a seaman. His hydrographical works remain, but above all, his careful treatment of his crews deserves to be remembered. To it was due their ability to bear the long and trying voyages which he made with so little loss of life. After this fatal day the English folded their tents and returned on board. Their offers for the recovery of the body of their unfortunate captain were in vain. In their anger they were about to have recourse to arms, when two priests, friends of Lieutenant King, brought a piece of human flesh at the instance of the other chiefs, which weighed from 9 to 10 pounds. It was all, they said, that remained of Rono's body, which had been burned according to custom. This sight of course made the English still more anxious for reprisals, and the natives on their side had to avenge the death of 5 chiefs and a score of men. Every time the English landed at their wandering place, they found a furious crowd armed with stones and sticks. In order to make an example, Captain Clerke, who had taken the command of the expedition, set fire to the abodes of the priests, and massacred those who opposed them. On the 19th of February, however, an interview was arranged, and the remains of Cook, his hands, recognizable by a large scar, his head, stripped of flesh, and various other debris were made over to the English, who 3 days later paid them the last honors. After that, barter was resumed as if nothing had happened, and no other incident occurred during the remainder of the stay in the Sandwich Islands. Captain Clerke had relinquished the command of the Discovery to Lieutenant Gore, and hoisted his flag upon the Resolution. After completing the survey of the Hawaiian Islands, he set sail for the north, touched at Kamtchatka, where the Russians made him heartily welcome, passed through Bering Strait, and advanced as far as latitude 69 degrees 50 minutes north, where his further progress was barred by icebergs. On the 22nd of April, Captain Clerke died of pulmonary phthisis, aged 38. Captain Gore then assumed the command in chief, put in again at Kamtchatka, again at Canton, and at the Cape of Good Hope, and anchored in the Thames on the 1st of October, 1780, after more than 4 years' absence. The death of Captain Cook caused a general mourning throughout England. The Royal Society of London, of which he was a member, struck a medal in his honour, the cost of which was covered by public subscription, to which persons of the highest rank subscribed. The Admiralty petitioned the king to provide for the family of the deceased captain. The king granted a pension of £200 to his widow, and £25 to each of his 3 sons. The charts and drawings relating to his last voyage were engraved at the expense of the government, and the proceeds of their sale divided among Cook's family, and the heirs of Captain Clerke and Captain King. Although the family of the great navigator is extinct, a proof of the esteem in which his memory is held was given in the solemn meeting of the French Geographical Society on the 4th of February, 1879. A large number assembled to celebrate the centenary of Cook's death. Amongst them were many representatives of the Australian colonies, which are now so flourishing, and of the Hawaiian archipelago, where he met his death. A quantity of relics belonging to the great navigator, his charts, Weber's magnificent water colours, and the instruments and weapons of the oceanic islanders decorated the walls. This touching homage, after the lapse of 100 years, was accorded by a people whose king had bidden them not to thwart Cook's scientific and civilizing mission, and was well calculated to awake an echo in England, and to draw yet closer the bonds of that good fellowship which exists between England and France. End of section 23. Section 24 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr Natter. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. Great Navigators of the 18th Century, by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 1, Part 1. French Navigators, 1a. Discoveries made by Bouvet de Lozier in the southern seas. Surville, the land of the Arsacides. Incident during the stay at Port Praslin. Arrival upon the coast of New Zealand. Death of Surville. Marion's discoveries in the Antarctic Ocean. He is murdered at New Zealand. Kerguelen in Iceland and the Antarctic regions. The contest between the watches. Fleurien and Verdun de la Crenne. In the earlier half of the 18th century, a discovery had been made which was destined to exercise a favorable influence upon the progress of geographical science. Jean-Baptiste Charles Bouvet de Lozier, a captain of one of the East India Company's ships, was so struck by the immensity of the space surrounding the southern pole, known to geographers as Terra Australis Incognita, that he begged for the privilege of prosecuting discoveries in these unknown regions. His importunities were long disregarded, but at length, in 1738, the company consented, in the hope of opening new facilities for trade. 2 small frigates, the Aigle and the Marie, fully equipped, left Brest upon the 19th of July, 1738, under command of Bouvet de Lozier. After a stay of a month at St. Catherine's Island, upon the coast of Brazil, they put to sea again upon the 13th of November, and steered for the southeast. On the 26th, heavy fog set in, so that the vessels could only keep in company by constant firing, and were obliged to tack about continually, at the risk of running foul of each other. Upon the 5th of December, although it would have appeared impossible, the fog increased in density to such an extent that those on board the Aigle could hear the movement of the Marie, though they could not see her. The sea was covered with kelp, and sea gulls, never found at the distance from land, were shortly afterwards seen. Upon the 15th of December, says M. Favre, in his Memoir de Bouvet, in 48 degrees 50' southern latitude (Paris is the northern latitude 48 degrees 50'), and in the 7 degrees western longitude (the meridian of Teneriffe), an enormous iceberg was perceived towards 5 or 6 in the morning. Shortly afterwards many others were seen, surrounded by ice floes of various sizes. The Marie, signalling danger, tacked about, but Bouvet, annoyed by this action, which was likely to affect the confidence of the crews, crowded sail on the Aigle, and, by passing the Marie, showed his determination to maintain his southern course. To reassure his men, he asserted that it was considered a lucky omen to meet with ice, as it was a certain indication of land at hand. The course was continued to the south, and Bouvet's perseverance was soon rewarded by the appearance of land, to which he gave the name of Cape Circumcision. It was steep, covered with snow, and so shut in by large icebergs that it was impossible to approach to within 7 or 8 leagues. It appeared to measure from 4 to 5 leagues from north to south. This land was supposed, says M. Favre, judging from Pieter Goss's charts, which were used by Bouvet, to be situated in 45 degrees southern latitude and 26 degrees and 27 degrees east of the meridian of Teneriffe, or between 5 degrees 30' and 6 degrees 3' east of that of Paris. Bouvet would much have liked to make closer acquaintance with this region, but the fogs and contrary winds prevented his reaching it, and he was obliged to satisfy himself with observing it from a distance. Upon the 3rd of January 1739, says Bouvet in his report to the company, we made up for what we had lost during the preceding days, and about 4 in the afternoon, the fog clearing somewhat, we distinctly saw land. The coast, broken throughout its entire length, formed several bays. The summits of the mountains were covered with snow, the sides appeared wooded. After several fruitless attempts to near the coast, Bouvet was forced to relinquish his idea. His sailors were worn out with fatigue, discouraged and enfeebled by scurvy. The Marie was sent to the Isle of France, and the Aigle directed her course to the Cape of Good Hope, which she reached upon the 28th of February. We had penetrated, says Bouvet in his report already cited, 12 or 15,000 leagues into the unknown sea. For 70 days we had encountered almost continuous fog. We had been for 40 days in the midst of ice, and we had had snow and hail almost every day. Several times our decks and rigging were covered with them. Our shrouds and sails were frozen. On the 10th of January it was impossible to work our fore topsail. The cold was severe for men accustomed to a warm climate and who were lightly clad. Many had chilblains on the hands and feet. Still they were forced constantly to tack about, bring to, get under way, and tack soundings at least once a day. One of the sailors belonging to the Aigle, having been sent to loosen the fore topsail, became frozen in the foretop. He had to be lowered by a whip, and circulation was with difficulty restored. I have seen others with tears gushing from their eyes as they handled the sounding line. And all this was in the fine season, and I ameliorated their condition by every means in my power. We can readily understand that such small results did not tempt the East India Company to continue their efforts in these latitudes. If they were productive of no good, they cost heavily in the loss of men and ships they entailed. Still, Bouvet's discovery was a first blow to the existing belief in an Antarctic continent. He gave the start, and various navigators, amongst them 2 Frenchmen, followed it up. In our short record of this expedition, which is scarcely known, we have testified to an appreciation of our countryman, who was the pioneer of Antarctic navigation, and who deserves the credit of furnishing an example to the great English explorer James Cook. Another of the East India Company's captains, who had distinguished himself in various battles against the English, Jean-François Marie de Surville, was destined to make important discoveries in Oceania, some 30 years later, and to rediscover, almost simultaneously with Cook, the lands first seen by Tasman, and which he called Staten Island. The following is an account of the circumstances. Messieurs Law and Chevalier, governors in French India, determined to send a vessel at their own risk to trade in the southern seas. They admitted Surville to their schemes, and sent him to France to obtain the needful authority from the company, and to superintend the equipment of the vessel. The Saint Jean Baptiste was made ready for sea at Nantes, and provisioned for 3 years, with every requisite for a distant expedition. Surville then reached India, where Law provided him with 24 native soldiers. Leaving Angley Bay on the 3rd of March 1769, the Saint Jean Baptiste put in successfully at Masulipatam, Yanaon, and Pondicherry, where her equipment was completed. Surville left the last named port on the 2nd of June, and steered his course for the Philippines. On the 20th of August he cast anchor off the Bashees, or Bashy Islands. Dampierre had so named them after an intoxicating drink which the natives compounded from the juice of the sugar cane, into which they infused a certain black seed. Several of Dampierre's crew had formerly deserted in these islands. They had received from the natives a field, agricultural instruments, and wives. The recollection of this fact incited 3 of the sailors belonging to the Saint Jean Baptiste to follow their example. But Surville was not the man to allow his crew to melt away in such a manner. He seized 26 Indians, and signified his intention of keeping them as hostages until his men were brought back to him. Among the Indians thus seized, says Crozet in his narrative of Surville's voyage, there were several courageous enough to throw themselves into the sea, and, much to the surprise of the crew, they had sufficient courage and skill to swim to one of their pirogues, which was far enough from the vessel to be secure from danger. Pains were taken to make the savages understand that they had been treated in this way in order to make their comrades bring back the 3 deserters. They made signs that they understood, and were then released, with the exception of 6, who had been taken on shore. The haste with which they left the ship, and flung themselves into their pirogues, augured badly for their return. Much surprise was therefore felt, when in a short time they were seen returning with joyful acclamations. Doubt was no longer possible, they could only be bringing the deserters back to the commander. They came on board, and proceeded to deposit on deck what? 3 magnificent pigs, tied and bound. Surville did not appreciate, and he objurgated the natives so fiercely that they jumped into their pirogues and disappeared. 24 hours later the Saint Jean Baptiste left the Bashees, taking 3 captive Indians to replace the deserters. Upon the 7th of October, after a lengthened route to the southeast, land, to which the name of Première Vue was given, was sighted in 6 degrees 56 minutes southern latitude, and 157 degrees 30 minutes longitude east of Paris. The explorers coasted along it until the 13th of October, upon which day an excellent port was discovered, shielded from every wind, and formed by a number of small islands. M. de Surville cast anchor and named it Port Praslin. It is situated in 7 degrees 25 minutes southern latitude, and 151 degrees 55 minutes eastern longitude, reckoning from the Paris meridian. Upon entering this port, the French saw several Indians, armed with spears, and carrying a sort of shield. The Saint Jean Baptiste was very soon surrounded by pirogues, manned by a crowd of Indians, who were profuse in menacing gestures. However, they were pacified at last. About 30 of the boldest clambered on to the deck, and examined everything they saw with close attention. It soon became needful to check their advances, as there were many sick among the crew, and it was unwise to allow too many natives on board. In spite of the welcome they received, the natives were still doubtful, and their looks expressed distrust. The slightest movement on board the vessel was sufficient to make them jump into their pirogues or the sea. One only showed a little more confidence, and Surville gave him several presents. The Indian acknowledged the attention by saying he could point out a spot where good water was to be had. The captain gave orders to arm the boats, and entrusted the command to his lieutenant, Labbé. The savages appeared impatient for the departure of the boats from the ship, says Fleurien in his Découvertes des Français, and they were no sooner lowered than they were followed by all the pirogues. One of these appeared to lead the others. In it was the Indian who had offered his services to Surville. At the back of the pirogue a man stood erect, holding in his hands a bunch of herbs, raising them above his head with a rhythmical movement. In the center of the same pirogue stood a young man, resting upon a spear, who gravely watched all that went on. Red flowers were in his ears, and passed through the cartilage of his nose, and his hair was powdered with white lime. Certain thrilling symptoms aroused the suspicion of the French, who soon found themselves in a cul de sac, where the natives persisted in declaring that fresh water was to be found. Labbé, in spite of all the persuasions of the natives, did not wish to imperil his boats in 2 or 3 feet of water, with a muddy bottom, and therefore allowed only a corporal and 4 soldiers to disembark. They soon returned, asserting that they had seen on all sides nothing but marsh, in which the men would sink to the waist. It was evident that the natives had meditated treason. Labbé took good care not to let them suspect that he had detected their design, and asked them to point out a spring. The natives then led the boats some 3 leagues away, to a spot from whence it was impossible to see the ship. The corporal was again sent forward with some men, but he found only a very poor spring, barely affording sufficient water to slake the thirst of his party. During his absence, the natives did all in their power to induce Labbé to land, pointing out to him the abundant cocoanuts and other fruit trees, and even attempting to possess themselves of the boat hook. More than 250 of these natives, says the narrative, armed with spears from 7 to 8 feet long, with swords or wooden clubs, arrows and stones, and some carrying shields, were assembled on the shore, observing the movements of the boats. When the detachment, consisting of 5 men, proceeded to re-embark, the natives fell upon them, wounding 1 soldier with a blow from a club, the corporal with a spear, and many others in different ways. M. Labbé himself was hit by 2 arrows in the thigh, and on the leg by a stone. The traitors were fired upon. The first volley so astonished them that they remained motionless. It was the more fatal, as, being fired only 3 or 5 fathoms from the boats, every shot took effect. The amazement of the natives gave the opportunity for a second discharge, which completely routed them, the death of their chief greatly hastening their flight. M. Labbé, who had recognized him, apart from the others, with his hands raised to heaven, striking his breast and encouraging the assailants by his voice, aimed at him and shot him dead. The natives carried off their wounded, leaving 30 or 40 dead upon the field of battle. It was then possible to land, and picking up such of the enemy's weapons as were scattered about, the victors contented themselves with towing away one of their pirogues and destroying the others. Surville was extremely anxious to capture an Indian who might serve him as a guide, and who, convinced of the superiority of European weapons, might warn his countrymen against opposing the French. With this view he hit upon a singular expedient. He ordered 2 negro sailors to be placed on board the pirogue he had seized, had their heads powdered, and disguised them so cleverly that the natives were likely to be deceived. In fact, a pirogue, soon after approaching the Saint Jean Baptiste, the men who were in it, seeing what they took to be 2 of their own people, trafficking with the strangers, drew nearer. So soon as the French imagined they were at a fair distance, they launched 2 boats in pursuit. The natives gained ground. It was then decided to fire, in order to stop them. One of the natives was killed at once, and his boat capsizing, he fell into the sea, and the other, who was only 14 or 15 years of age, endeavored to reach the shore by swimming. He defended himself most courageously, says the narrative, sometimes making believe to bite himself, but really biting those who held him. His hands and feet were tied, and he was taken on board. He counterfeited death for an hour, but when he was made to sit up, and he fell back on deck, he took good care to fall on his shoulders instead of his head. When he was tired of playing this game, he opened his eyes, and, seeing that the crew were eating, he asked for a biscuit, ate it with a good appetite, and made many expressive signs. He was bound securely, so that he might not throw himself overboard. During the night it was necessary to resort to firing, to disperse the pirogues, which approached with a view to surprising the ship. Next day the native was taken in a boat to a small islet, since called Aiguada Island. Scarcely had he landed when it was perceived that he had almost cut through the ropes with a sharp shell. The young savage was taken by a different route to the shore, when he perceived that he was to re-embark, and biting the sand in his fury. The sailors succeeded at last in finding an abundant spring and plenty of wood. One of the trees they cut appeared to have dyeing properties, for it tinged the sea with red. Some of the bark was boiled, and pieces of cotton steeped in the decoction turned deep red. Welcome refreshment was afforded to the crew by the palm cabbages, good oysters, and various shellfish which abounded. There were indeed many sufferers from scurvy on board the Saint Jean Baptiste. Surville had looked forward to this stay to cure them, but the rain, which fell ceaselessly for 6 days, aggravated their complaint to such a degree that 3 of them died before they left the anchorage. The port was named Praslin, and the large island or archipelago to which it belonged, Arsacides, in reference to the deceitful nature of its inhabitants. Port Praslin, says Fleurien, would be one of the finest ports in the world if the bottom were better. It is of circular shape, reckoning all the islands discovered from the spot where the Saint Jean Baptiste cast anchor. The ferocity of the people inhabiting the islands of Port Praslin was such that it was impossible to penetrate into the interior, and it was only possible to examine the sea coast. We perceived no cultivated ground, either in the trip we made to the further end of the port, nor upon the Aiguade Island, which was explored throughout. Such are the superficial particulars which Surville and his crew were able to collect. Fortunately, they were supplemented by those furnished by the captive native, whose name was Lova Salega, and who possessed a great faculty for learning languages. According to his account, the island produced palms, cocoa-nut trees, various almond trees, wild coffee, the ebony tree, the takamahak, as well as numerous resinous and gum trees, the banana, sugar-cane, yams, aniseed, and lastly a plant called binao, which is used by the natives as bread. Cockatoos, wood pigeons, lories, and blackbirds, somewhat larger than those of Europe, abounded in the woods. In the marshes the curlew, sea lark, a species of snipe, and ducks were to be found. The only quadrupeds the country produced were goats and half-wild pigs. The natives of Port Praslin, says Fleurien, quoting from the manuscript in his possession, are of ordinary height, but strong and muscular. They do not appear to be all of one origin, a valuable remark, for some are perfectly black, whilst others are copper-colored. The former have woolly hair, which is very soft to the touch. Their foreheads are small, their eyes slightly sunken, while the lower parts of their face is pointed and adorned with a small beard. Their expression is fierce. Some of the copper-colored natives have smooth hair. They usually cut it round the head, as high as the ear. A few only retain a little, shaped like a cap, on the top of the head, shaving off the remainder with a sharp stone, and leaving only a circular fringe about an inch deep at the bottom. Their hair and eyebrows are powdered with lime, which gives them a yellowish hue. Both men and women are stark naked, but it must be allowed that their nudity is not so startling as would be that of an European without clothes, for the faces, arms, and generally every part of their bodies are tattooed. Sometimes the taste of these designs is really wonderful. They pierce their ears and the cartilage of their nose, and the nostrils often hang down from the weight of the ornaments to the upper lip. The commonest ornament worn by the natives of Port Praslin is a necklace made of men's teeth. It was at once concluded that they were cannibals, although the same customs had been met with among people who were not. Lova's confused replies, and the half-broiled head of a man, found by Bougainville in a pirogue in Choiseul Island, placed the existence of this barbarous practice beyond the possibility of doubt. Section 24.